She was 22 years old, and by every measure the world cared to apply, she had nothing. Her stepfather, Counsel Draper, a man who kept his emotions locked as tightly as the strongbox beneath his office floor, had made his position clear on the morning of her birthday, with a kind of efficiency that only a man who had never loved her could manage. She was not a daughter. She was a remaining obligation, and the obligation was now closed. We want you to settle in, because this is the story of Lottie Vane. And if you have ever been told that your worth could be calculated and found wanting, we think you are going to want to hear how it ended. Lottie's real education had not come in a schoolhouse. It had come in the back room of Augustin Farrall's cabinet shop. On the edge of Harwick, Missouri, where the smell of pine resin and linseed oil was so deep in the walls it seemed to come from the wood itself. Augustin Farrall had been her mother's uncle, a bachelor, with sawdust in his beard, and a patience that bordered on the religious. When Lottie's mother died of fever, the summer Lottie turned 9, and her father had already been 3 years in the ground from a mining accident. It was Augustin who came for her, not with fanfare, not with paperwork. He simply arrived at the house where she had been staying with a neighbor woman, picked up her small bundle of clothes, and said, "You'll come with me then." He was not a man of many words, but the words he did use were precise and purposeful. The same way he used his chisels. He taught her that wood was not a passive material. It had memory, it had intention. A board that had grown on the south side of a tree would always want to curve away from where it had been, and you had to know that before you ever set it to a frame, or it would work against you for the life of whatever you built. You read the wood first, he would tell her, turning a plank in his hands, sighting down its length the way a rifleman sights a barrel. Every piece has a story. Your job is to listen before you start telling your own. He taught her to cut dovetails by hand, the angle precise and unforgiving, joints that needed no glue because the geometry itself was the strength. He taught her the difference between a mortise chisel and a bench chisel, taught her to keep an edge sharp enough to pare end grain, clean as a whistle. He gave her her own set of tools when she turned 14, a small roll of canvas holding 6 chisels, a marking gauge, and a dovetail saw with a back of polished brass, all of it used but well kept, the handles worn to a warm dark honey from years of work. A tool that's been used is better than one that hasn't, he told her. It's already learned what it's for. When Lottie was 17, Augustin Farrall sat down in his favorite chair by the shop's small stove on a January evening and did not get up again. The doctor said it was his heart. Lottie had always thought it was more that his heart had simply finished everything it set out to do. The shop, the tools, the small house behind it, all of it went to a nephew in St. Louis, whom Augustin had mentioned once in 10 years. The nephew arrived, sold everything in a week, and was gone before the ground had properly thawed over Augustin's grave. Counsel Draper had been her mother's second husband, a man she had married the year before she died. Lottie had never called him father. He had a tidy house, a tidy ledger, and a tidy set of opinions about what people were worth. He had taken Lottie in after Augustin died, not because he felt any particular tenderness toward her, but because the minister had suggested it, and Counsel Draper cared a great deal about what ministers and neighbors thought of him. For 5 years she lived in his house. She kept it clean. She cooked. She helped with his books in the evenings because she had a head for numbers, and he had discovered this was useful. He did not thank her. He did not speak to her much at all, except to direct work or correct something she had done. When she asked once if she might set up a small workbench in the shed to practice the joinery Augustin had taught her, he had looked at her the way a man looks at a stranger who is asked to borrow money. "That is not a skill a woman needs," he said, and went back to his newspaper. She kept the tool roll hidden at the bottom of her trunk. She kept her hands busy with the house. She kept Augustin's lessons in a quiet room at the back of her mind, a room she visited in the dark when the rest of the house was still. On the morning of her 22nd birthday, Counsel Draper called her into his front room before breakfast. He was standing by the window. He did not invite her to sit. "You are a grown woman now," he said, with the tone of a man delivering a weather report. "It is not appropriate for you to continue living in this house. People will talk." He placed an envelope on the mantelpiece. "I have purchased you a rail ticket to Opaline, Kansas. There is a women's boarding house there run by a Mrs." He consulted a slip of paper. "Tamblin. I have written ahead. They will have a room for 30 days. Inside the envelope is $12 for your expenses." She looked at him. He looked out the window. "You can collect your things this morning," he said. "The noon train." She picked up the envelope. She said, "I understand." She did not say thank you, because she did not feel it, and Augustine Farral had taught her that precision mattered, even in words. She went upstairs, packed her trunk, and placed the canvas tool roll at the very bottom, the way she always did. At 11:30, she walked to the station alone, her trunk on a borrowed handcart, and stood on the platform of Harwick Depot, without looking back at the tidy house on Crestwell Street, or the tidy man who lived inside it. The train to Opaline ran through flat country that grew flatter and paler as the hours passed. The green of Missouri softened into the yellowed grass of the Kansas plain, and the sky opened up in a way that felt less like freedom and more like exposure, like something that had been hiding behind hills and trees had suddenly been taken away. Lottie sat with her trunk between her feet and counted her money twice. $12. 30 days. Then what? She was on her second day of travel when she heard the conversation. Two men in the seat ahead of her, speaking without much concern for who might be listening. One of them worked for a land company. The other was a surveyor. The land company man was talking about a property outside a small settlement called Dunmore Crossing, about 40 miles west of Opaline. An old timber operation that had gone under in the late 1880s. A mill site, a cluster of outbuildings, and a main structure, a large lumber barn with heavy timber framing, the kind of construction that didn't exist anymore because the men who knew how to build it were mostly dead. The land company had acquired the property for back taxes. They wanted to sell it off in pieces for the timber value, haul out whatever hadn't rotted. The problem, the land company man said, is the main barn. Doors are swelled shut, locks rusted solid. We've had 2 men try to get in with a pry bar and they gave up. Nobody local wants to buy a barn, they can't even look inside. What's in it? The surveyor asked. No one knows. Mill records say it was used for equipment storage when they closed. Could be nothing. Could be dry rotten mice. Either way, company's selling the lot at auction next Friday for whatever they can get. Lottie looked out the window at the flat-moving land and felt something stir in her chest. Not a plan, exactly. More like the first shape of one, the rough outline before you set it to the wood. She changed her ticket at the next junction. Dunmore Crossing was 3 buildings and a post office. The auctions was held on the flat ground in front of the county assessor's temporary office, which was really just a man with a folding table and a handwritten sign. There were perhaps 15 bidders, local men, a couple of timber buyers from Wichita who had ridden out specifically and wore it in their expressions, impatient and calculating. The property came up in lots. The land went first, then the smaller outbuildings, their contents already stripped and inspected. The main lumber barn came last. It was enormous. Even at a distance, Lottie could see it was different from the other structures on the property, built on a different order of intention. Heavy timbers, still holding true after 20 years of abandonment. The siding had weathered to a silver gray, but the framing beneath it was dense old-growth oak. She could see that in the exposed corners, the grain tight as rope. The doors were 2 great sliding panels, each 10 feet tall, and they had swelled and rusted into their tracks, as though the barn had decided it was done being opened. Lot 11, the assessor called out, sounding tired. Main structure, contents unknown. Sold as is. Buyer takes the building and everything in it. Company won't be responsible for removal. We'll start at $10. Silence. The Wichita men conferred in low voices and shook their heads. The cost of getting those doors open, they had clearly calculated, wasn't worth it when they couldn't know what was inside. $8? $7? Lottie raised her hand. $5, she said. A few of the men glanced at her. The assessor looked at her the way the auctioneer in the original story had looked at Nell, a mixture of surprise and tired pity. But we're telling Lottie's story now, not Nell's, and Lottie did not flinch. $5 from the young woman. Do I have 6? $5.50? No one moved. The Wichita men had already turned toward their horses. Sold for $5. She paid from the envelope Counsel Draper had given her. She took the deed of sale, a single sheet with a smeared ink stamp. She now owned a barn she couldn't open in a settlement that barely had a name, with $7 remaining to her name. She walked to the barn and pressed her palm flat against the great sliding door. The wood beneath the weathered surface was still solid. She could feel it. The first problem was not the barn. It was sleeping. She found a room at a widow's house on the edge of the settlement, $2 for the week, meals included. The widow's name was Agnes Pruell, a compact woman in her 60s with opinions about everything, and the grace not to share most of them unprompted. She sized Lottie up in about 30 seconds and said, "You can wash up at the pump in back. Supper's at 6. Lottie ate, slept, and woke before the light with the problem of the barn doors already arranged in her mind like a set of joints to be cut. She knew what the pry bar men had done wrong. You could not force a swelled door sideways in its track. The track was the problem, the rust and the warped wood, and 20 years of the wood trying to become one piece with its frame. You had to address the interference directly. You had to think like the wood, which meant she needed a mallet, a set of chisels, and access to the track itself. She found her tools where she always kept them. She unrolled the canvas on the floor of her room at Agnes's house and lined them up in order, the way Augustin had taught her. She picked up the largest chisel, a 1-inch firmer that had belonged to him, its handle darkened with decades of his grip, lighter where her own hands had taken over. She turned it in the light from the window. "Let's see what we've got," she said, to no one, to him, to the habit of talking to the work that he had given her. The settlement had a small hardware supply, run out of the back of the dry goods store by a man named Burl Haverstock, who also fixed wagon wheels, and had a face that looked like it had seen more winters than it wanted. When she described what she needed, additional chisels in 2 sizes, a wooden mallet, heavy oil for the track, he didn't ask many questions. He watched her hands when she demonstrated the angle she wanted on a chisel edge, and then nodded to himself. "You know woodwork," he said. "My teacher did," she said. "I learned from watching him." Burl Haverstock gave her a small discount on the mallet and didn't explain why. The work at the barn took 4 days. Not 4 days of continuous labor, but 4 days of patient, methodical work. The kind Augustin had spent years teaching her was the only kind worth doing. She began with the tracks, pouring oil onto the rust in the morning and letting it sit through the heat of the day. In the afternoons, she used a wide chisel and mallet to clear the worst of the buildup, working in sections, never forcing, always reading the resistance before she pushed against it. The wood of the door had swelled into the frame in 2 places, and she worked those joints carefully, cutting thin reliefs on either side to give the panel room to move again. Burl Haverstock came by on the 2nd afternoon and watched for a while without speaking. On the 3rd day, he came back with his apprentice, a boy of about 16 named Dovey, who carried a 2nd can of oil and an expression of frank curiosity. They didn't offer to help in a way that would have taken the work away from her. They simply made themselves available, and when she needed someone to hold steady pressure on one side of a door while she worked the other, they were there. On the morning of the 4th day, the right-hand door moved. It moved only an inch at first, a grinding, reluctant shift that sent a shower of rust dust down onto the ground, but it moved. Lottie felt the resistance give, felt the grain of the work change the way Augustin had described the feeling. When a joint finally seated, a rightness that came up through your hands before your mind had processed it. She set her feet, both hands on the edge of the door, and pushed with her whole weight, and Dovey pushed beside her, and the door opened, groaning on its salvaged track, scraping and shuddering, and then rolling free into the full morning light. The air that came out was extraordinary. Not foul, not rotten, which was the first surprise. It was cool and dry, and it carried the smell of aged wood, of resin, of iron, the smell of a workshop that had been waiting. When their eyes adjusted to the interior light, they stood still for a long moment. The barn was a timber framer's cathedral. The structural bents rose 30 feet to the peak, massive posts and beams, joined with wooden pegs the size of a man's fist. The joinery so precise that the gaps between members were barely the width of a thumbnail, even after 20 years of settling. Lottie had never seen work on this scale. She had seen Augustin's cabinet joints and understood their logic, and she saw the same logic here, only magnified, heroic in its proportions. But it was the contents that stopped her breath. The barn was filled with tools, not scattered, not piled in neglect, arranged, organized along the walls on heavy wooden racks, sorted by type and size with the same intuitive logic she had seen in Augustin's own shop. Planes, hundreds of them in every size, from small block planes that could fit in a coat pocket to great jointing planes 5 feet long, laid runners up on their racks to protect the blades, draw knives, froes, handsaws in graduated lengths, timber framing tools, slicks and mortising chisels and corner chisels with blades as wide as her hand, spoke shaves, travashers, a full set of wooden-bodied molding planes, 40 at least, their profiles still sharp. In the back, in the deepest shadows, 3 workbenches with built-in vises, and beside them, a complete set of marking and measuring tools laid out as if the craftsman had simply stepped away for a moment. There was a man, not a skeleton this time, not in this story, but there was a man's presence nonetheless. A broad flat desk built into the corner, and on it, a ledger open to its last entry, and beside the ledger, a small wooden box, and on top of the box, a note in careful handwriting that had been there long enough for the ink to brown at the edges. Lottie crossed the barn floor, her footsteps quiet on the packed earth, and picked up the note. It was from a man who signed himself Tobias Leonard, master joiner. And he wrote that he had been the foreman of the Dunmore mill when it closed in 1891. He had known the closure was coming for months before the owners admitted it. And he had watched those same owners, most particularly a man named Gareth Spence, who held the controlling interest, strip every piece of portable machinery from the mill for private sale, while telling the workers their wages would be settled in full once the final timber contracts were executed. They never were. When the closure came, Gareth Spence disappeared to Chicago with the liquid assets of the operation, and left behind 43 workers who were owed between 6 and 20 weeks' wages each. Tobias Leonard had seen this coming. He had also seen what Gareth Spence had not valued: the hand tools, the fine woodworking equipment that the mill had accumulated over 30 years, purchased for the finish work, the bespoke architectural lumber that had been the company's highest margin product. Spence had dismissed it. Machinery, he understood. Hand tools, in his view, were the cheap things any man could buy at a hardware counter. But Tobias Leonard knew what those tools were worth. Some of them were irreplaceable, made by craftsmen who were already gone, the kind of work that was passing out of the world as factories took over. He had spent the last 2 weeks before closure quietly, methodically moving every tool he could into the barn, organizing them, oiling them, protecting them. He had sealed the barn not to hide anything shameful but to protect something he believed ought to be protected. He did not take them for himself. This was the part that made Lottie read the note twice, then a third time. He had left them, and in the ledger she found his accounting of why. The ledger contained the name of every man who had been cheated of wages when the Dunmore mill closed their hometowns, the amounts owed, and beside each name, a notation, a tool, or a set of tools that Tobias Leonard had appraised at fair market value, tools he had set aside and earmarked as belonging to that man's debt. He had created a catalog of restitution in handwritten script so precise and clear it looked like it had been typeset. He had sealed the barn and trusted that someone would come along eventually who would understand what they were looking at and know what to do with it. At the bottom of the last page, he had written, "I could not pay these men myself, but I could preserve the means of their payment and trust in the honesty of whoever finds this. These are not my tools to sell. Please see that the men, or their families, receive what they are owed." The truth of what Gareth Spence did is in this ledger. It will speak for itself. Tobias Leonard had died in 1903. She found this out later, from Agnes Pruell, who had known him by reputation. He had never spoken publicly of what he had done. He had simply done it, and then he had carried the knowledge of it quietly until he was gone. Lottie stood in the cathedral of his work and held his ledger and felt the weight of what had been placed, unknowingly, into her hands by a $5 bid at a county auction. She sat down on one of the workbenches. Burl Haverstock and Dovey stood near the door, not speaking, giving her the room a moment like that required. She opened the ledger to the first entry. The first name was Thomas Breck, lathe operator, last known address, Carthage, Missouri. Wages owed, $41.80. Appraised tools set aside. A full set of turning tools, value $45. She turned the pages slowly. 43 names, amounts ranging from $20 to over $100. And beside each one, Tobias Leonard's careful appraisal of the tools he had matched to the debt, the arithmetic of a man trying to balance the books of another man's theft. The revelation of what Gareth Spence had done did not arrive like a thunderclap. It arrived the way wood splits along its grain when you've set the chisel correctly. Quietly, inevitably, the truth opening up along a line that had always been there. She spent that evening at Agnes Pruell's table, explaining what she had found. Agnes listened without interrupting, which Lottie would later understand was a significant act of restraint for Agnes. Burl Haverstock had come too, sitting at the far end of the table with his cap in his hands, looking at the ledger when Lottie passed it to him. "Gareth Spence," Agnes said at last, pronouncing the name the way you might name a specific kind of weather that had damaged your roof. "He's in Chicago still. Has been. Somebody pointed him out to me in a newspaper once, a business announcement, railroad investment something. Smiling like a man who's never been owed an apology in his life. He won't be touched by this," Burl said. He said it plainly, without anger, the way a man says something he has learned from experience. Man like that, 30 years gone. You'd need a lawyer and a judge, and the willingness to be in a courthouse for a year. And even then, Lottie looked at the ledger. "I'm not going to court," she said. They looked at her. "Tobias Leonard didn't leave me a court case," she said. "He left me a list of names and a barn full of tools. I'm going to do what he asked." The logic of it was the same logic as a dovetail joint. You didn't need anything external to hold it together. The geometry was the strength. Finding the families was the work of weeks. The ledger gave her towns and names, and she started with the ones closest to hand. She wrote letters first. Simple letters that explained she was writing on behalf of the Dunmore Mill settlement. That a record had been found of wages owed to the named worker. And that the estate was prepared to make good on the debt if the family would write back to confirm the connection. Some letters came back undeliverable. Some came back with responses she hadn't expected. A son in Iowa who had heard the story of his father's cheating so many times it had become part of the family's understanding of how the world worked. A daughter in Carthage who kept the letter and wrote back in a hand so careful it was clearly her best, saying, her father Thomas Breck had died in 1907, but she was his eldest child, and she had 3 brothers who were still alive. Lottie drove out to meet the Breck family herself, renting a wagon from Burl Haverstock and bringing the turning tools Tobias Leonard had set aside for Thomas Breck wrapped in oilcloth, because they were worth more to a working craftsman than the coins they represented, and one of the Breck sons was a woodworker. She also brought the cash equivalent, the $41.80 calculated in the ledger, money she had raised by selling 3 of the large jointing planes to a cabinet maker in Opaline, who had nearly wept when she showed them to him. She did not mention Gareth Spence by name at that first meeting. She didn't need to. She said only that the mill's remaining assets had been found and accounted for, and that the ledger clearly showed what Thomas Breck was owed. She presented the tools and the cash with the receipt she asked each family to sign, a simple document acknowledging what had been received. The second Breck son, a man named Carver Breck, a big quiet man who worked a farm outside Carthage, held one of his father's turning tools for a long time before he said anything. It was a skew chisel, the handle replaced at some point but the blade original, the steel still clean and true from 30 years in a dry barn. He used to talk about those tools, Carver Breck said. Said he'd never had a better set. Said they took them along with everything else. They didn't take them, Lottie said. Someone protected them. A man named Tobias Leonard. She told them about the ledger then, about the sealed barn, about a foreman who had understood what was happening and had done the only thing available to him, the quiet, unrecognized thing, and trusted that time and honesty would do the rest. Carver Breck looked out the window for a long moment. Then he said, I'd like to know where he's buried if you find out. I'd like to send flowers. She found out. She sent him the information in a letter. She heard later from Agnes that a small group of families had put together a proper stone for Tobias Leonard's grave, which had previously been marked only with a wooden post. They'd had his name cut into granite, and below it, he kept faith. Word of what Lottie was doing moved through the network of families before she did. By the time she reached the 7th or 8th name on the list, the families already knew she was coming. Some of them had contacted each other. A man in Joplin, whose father had been a Finnish carpenter at the mill, drove 3 hours to meet her at the barn, and spent an afternoon going over the tools with her, identifying pieces she hadn't recognized, explaining their purpose with the reverence of someone handling relics. The tools sold steadily to people who understood what they were. Craftsmen, cabinet makers, a building contractor in Wichita who had been looking for timber framing equipment for a restoration project and could not believe what he was looking at when Lottie showed him the barn. Each sale was documented. Each payment was matched to a name in the ledger. The receipts accumulated in a wooden box she kept on the desk Tobias Leonard had built. She kept Augustine's tools. She kept the canvas roll with his 6 chisels, the marking gauge, the dovetail saw. These were not for sale and never would be. As the settlements spread out through the families, the ledger's story became impossible to ignore. Not because Lottie announced it, but because 30 families now possessed a document explaining what Gareth Spence had done, signed by a dead foreman's meticulous hand, with their own signed receipts attached as evidence of what the stolen wages had looked like in real terms. A man in Chicago who wrote about business matters for a newspaper followed the story from a tip he got from one of the Breck sons. He reached out to Lottie, who met with him once in the parlor of Agnes Pruell's house, and showed him the ledger and said simply, "The record speaks for itself. I'm just finishing the accounting." Gareth Spence was not prosecuted. He was too old, too removed, too well lawyered for that. But the story ran in 3 papers, and the version of his name that existed in the world after that was a different thing than it had been before. His business partners grew cautious. His social standing, which had been built on the story of self-made success, developed a fault line that people talked about in low voices. He did not disappear entirely, the way Silas Blackwood had in the story we were telling before. That was a different story. But he contracted, pulled back. The light around him went smaller. Lottie Vane was not satisfied by this in the way a person wants to be satisfied by justice. She had not done any of it to see Gareth Spence diminished, and she found that she did not feel particularly triumphant. What she felt was something quieter and more sustainable, the feeling of a joint cut true, the satisfaction that comes not from the finishing, but from the precision of the work itself. She stayed in Dunmore Crossing. This surprised her more than it surprised Agnes Pruell, who had simply begun setting a permanent place for her at the supper table sometime in the third week, and never stopped. Burl Haverstock offered her the back half of his workshop to set up a proper bench, and she took it. She began doing repair work for people, the kind of small, careful jobs that communities always have and rarely have someone skilled enough to do well. A split chair rail, a door that had never hung correctly, a set of cabinet hinges mortised into a frame that had shifted. She was not running a business yet. She was running what Augustine would have called a practice, the daily work of keeping your hands in the material, keeping your eye calibrated, staying honest with the chisel. The barn became something unexpected. After the last of the tools were settled, and the last receipt was signed, what remained was the structure itself, the timber-framed cathedral that Tobias Leonard had sealed and trusted to the future. Lottie had the legal deed. The building was hers. She opened it, not as a sale, not as a real estate transaction. She opened the doors, the ones she had freed, and began letting the community use the space. A local man who worked in decorative iron began setting up a small forge at the far end. Two brothers, who had inherited a sawmill partnership and needed a covered workspace to do their finish cutting, took a corner on a handshake agreement. A woman who made furniture from salvaged lumber asked if she could bring her tools in out of the weather, while she was working on a commission too large for her house. The barn filled slowly, the way things fill when they fill right, without rushing, without a plan, more specific than the intention to be useful. On the morning she paid the final debt on the ledger, a woman named Orvis Kettridge, who was the granddaughter of a stonemason's, whose father had done the masonry work on the mill's foundation, and who was the very last name in Tobias Leonard's accounting. Lottie came home to Agnes Pruell's house and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the empty canvas roll from which she had removed Augustine's tools that morning to use, and had not yet repacked. She looked at the roll. She thought about him, the sawdust in his beard, the patience that bordered on the religious. The way he said everything has a story, your job is to listen before you start telling your own. She had listened. She had found a barn full of stories, and a ledger full of names, and a dead foreman's act of faith. And she had done, as precisely as she could, what the work asked of her. She had not become wealthy. After the final payment and the costs of her own living and the sale of the tools, she had about $40, and the bench in Burl Haverstock's shop, and a small room at a widow's house where supper was at 6. She picked up Augustine's favorite chisel, the 1-inch firmer, with the darkened handle, and turned it in the light. It was a tool for making things true, for finding the line that was already there and following it. Her teacher had given it to her because he believed she had learned what it was for. She thought she was beginning to understand he had been right. She had left Harwick, Missouri with $12 and a canvas roll of tools and no destination worth the name. She had bought a locked barn for $5, found a foreman's testament sealed inside it, and spent the better part of a year following 43 names through a handwritten ledger to their rightful end. She had not set out to build a life in Dunmore Crossing. She had simply followed the grain of the work until it led her somewhere solid. It was, when she thought about it, the best $5 she had ever spent. If you have ever held on to something from someone who believed in you, something small, a tool or a letter, or just a way of seeing, we hope Lottie's story reminded you what that thing is worth. The things others overlook sometimes hold the whole weight of what comes next. And for our question today, has there been a time when following the honest work, just doing the next right thing without knowing where it led, brought you somewhere you could not have planned? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.